Hercule Poirot and the Picture That Turned by Itself. At Dawn, Chapter 1. The Whisper of the Canvas. The Dervaux country house, nestled in the Fontainebleau region, was a place that seemed to have been ripped from an impressionist painting. Wisteria wound around the stone columns, the roofs were covered with moss, and the air on spring nights smelled of lilacs and secrets. However, it was not the beauty of the setting that captured Mademoiselle Aimée Dervaux's attention in the early hours of April 7th, but rather an unusual sound for a silent mansion. A soft, repeated creaking, like something turning on a dry axis. She came down the stairs dressed in her silk dressing gown, barefoot, her footsteps almost as ghostly as the sound that had disturbed her sleep. The East Gallery, always locked at night, was mysteriously open, and there, among the shadows of ancient portraits, hanging at the far end of the hall like a sentinel of forgotten secrets, the old painting of the Night in Geneva, by Gustave Moreau, slowly revolved around itself, as if an invisible hand were adjusting it from behind. Aimée grinned. The next day, the gardener found Professor Julien Bernet, art historian, frequent guest of the Dervaux, and expert in pictorial symbolism, dead in his room, his head resting. On his desk, a small splinter of wood embedded in his right eye. The painting was back in its place, firm, motionless, as if it had never been moved. When Hercule Poirot received the letter, he was in Paris, dining at the Maximes with Inspector Lucien de Lattre de Sûreté. Reading the first few lines, he frowned. When he finished, he placed his napkin on his still steaming plate. "Dear ami, I'm afraid dinner will have to continue without me. A crime has occurred in Fontainebleau, and a painting has moved of its own accord. A case of spiritualism," Delattre quipped, "or a host with too much time on his hands." Poirot looked at him gravely. "When a painting spins on its own, it's never about art. It's about the soul." Fontainebleau greeted him with a dull sky and the damp scent of the trees. The Dervaux estate was elegant but distinctly old-fashioned, as if it had been preserved more out of melancholy than utility. Waiting for him there were Aimée Dervaux, daughter of the deceased owner and current heir, the butler Marcel, Aunt Geneviève with her perpetual wool shawl, and 3 guests still present. Colonel Armand Lemaitre, an old friend of the family, Lucille Bernet, the niece of the deceased professor, and Sylvain Rochefort, a young art restorer working on the house's painting inventory. Poirot examined the room where the death occurred. The body had already been removed, but the objects on the desk were still intact. A magnifying glass, an open book on medieval iconography, a half-empty brandy glass, and on the floor, a splinter of the frame from the painting. The Night in Geneva. Everything, except the cup, seemed to be arranged in a sickly order. The frame of the painting, however, showed slight damage in its lower corner. "Who found the body?" asked Poirot. Aimée said, her voice shaking. "After I heard the painting move, I went up and saw him there, with that thing in his eye. Oh, my God!" "And did anyone else hear or see anything?" inquired Poirot, walking towards the gallery. Colonel Lemaitre cleared his throat. "Lucille told me she heard him arguing on the phone, late, around 1 o'clock. Something about betrayal. Or theft. I don't remember." Lucille nodded without looking up. "My uncle was very nervous these days. He said someone had tampered with one of the most important pieces in the collection. Poirot examined the painting frame closely. Then he took a small round mirror out of his pocket and used it to look behind the canvas without touching it. A faint circular mark, a partial imprint perhaps from a glove, was visible on the wooden frame that held it. Mademoiselle Dervaux, Poirot said finally, I shall need a complete list of the works in this house and their locations, and also of your father's will. She blinked. The will? Yes. When art spins on its own in the night, there's always something or someone trying to overturn the past. That evening, Poirot strolled alone through the gallery. In the silence, the Belgian detective gently stroked the edge of the frame. Then, as if waiting for the painting to respond, he whispered, You've turned, but not for ghosts, no. Why, my friend, and for whom? Outside, the trees swayed slowly. Inside, the crime had barely begun to unfold its layers. Chapter 2. Interviews under diffuse light. The next morning dawned grey and misty, as if nature shared the uncertainty that reigned within the Dervaux mansion. Poirot, impeccable as ever with his neatly knotted tie and perfectly waxed moustache, requested a small room off the library for individual interviews. He insisted that no one be present except himself and the person being interviewed. The truth prefers solitude, he said. Aimée Dervaux was the first to enter. She was still grieving for her father, and her movements held a barely contained tension. Mademoiselle, Poirot began softly, you heard the painting turning. How exactly do you describe it? It wasn't a loud noise, monsieur. More like a dry creaking. At first I thought it was the wind, but the gallery was closed. When I saw it move, I felt a chill, as if something were warning me of danger. Was anyone else awake in the house? Not that I knew of. Everyone had retired early. Professor Bernet ate a light dinner and said he had work to do in his room. What was your relationship with him like? Cordial. He often came by to catalogue the works, although lately he seemed preoccupied, distant. He asked me several times if I was planning to sell any paintings. He seemed especially interested in the night in Geneva. And are you considering it? No. That painting was one of my father's favourites. I never thought of parting with it. Poirot nodded slightly, taking no notes, watching her closely as she nervously played with the clasp on her blouse. Thank you, Miss Next, was Colonel Lemaitre, who entered with a firm step and a direct gaze. You knew the late professor well, right? Enough to know that he was more possessive of the paintings than of his niece. Julian was a purist, one of those guys who believes every work should be where it was conceived. And here, well, he said that many pieces had been poorly restored. And what did you think of him? I respected his intellect, but he wasn't a good card player. He lied easily. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Was he lying? Yes, last Tuesday he told me he'd spend the day in Paris visiting a museum. But Marcel, the butler, told me the professor's car hadn't moved all day. Do you suspect he had an ulterior motive? I don't know. But when a man starts hiding things and then turns up dead with a splinter in his eye, well, you wonder if he saw too much. Poirot inclined his head, as if in gratitude for the involuntary metaphor. Lucille Bernet was the third. She entered with slow steps and a distant gaze. The girl, no more than 25 years old, had a pale face and eyes swollen from crying. "Mademoiselle, did you and your uncle live together?" "For 3 years now, yes. My parents died, and he took me in. He wasn't affectionate, but he gave me a home." "Was there any recent tension between you?" "Yes. I asked her permission to marry Sylvain Rochefort, but she refused. She said Sylvain was an opportunist, that he only wanted to get closer to the Dervaux. And what do you think? Didn't know him. Sylvain is good. He loves me." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Mademoiselle, you said yesterday that you heard your uncle arguing on the phone. Did you recognize the voice on the other end?" "No. He spoke softly, but he mentioned something about a copy, and that she shouldn't know." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "She?" Lucille nodded slowly. "He didn't say her name, but I think he was talking about Aimée." Finally, Sylvain Rochefort. Young, elegant, with delicate hands and well-balanced responses. "How long have you been working here, Monsieur Rochefort?" "Since January. My job was to review old frames and restore some 19th century oil paintings." "Did you have access to the framework of the night in Geneva?" "Just once, to clean it. But it didn't require restoration. It's in good condition, except for some minor damage to the base." "And did you mention it to anyone?" "Oh, with Professor Bernet. He said that painting must be hiding something. I thought he was exaggerating. And now I think maybe I was right. But I don't know what I was looking for." Poirot watched him closely. The young man avoided his gaze and rubbed his thumb against his forefinger like someone hiding impatience or fear. "Thank you, sir. That's all for now." When everyone had left, Poirot was left alone in the living room. He lit a small table lamp and opened his notebook without writing anything in it. A spinning picture, a professor obsessed with a revelation, and a closed circle where everyone knows more than they're letting on. He looked at his reflection in the window. And no one understands yet that the deepest traces are not on the canvas, but in the words that are not spoken. Poirot closed the notebook. The next piece would be moving soon. He just had to wait. Chapter 3. The Frame That Didn't Fit. On the third day of the investigation, Poirot requested full access to the east wing of the mansion, especially to the gallery where the night in Geneva. The butler Marcel led him with silent obedience, although his eyes betrayed a mixture of distrust and respect. The morning sun barely illuminated the room, and the portraits on either side seemed to be watching the Belgian detective as he paused in front of the painting. Poirot studied the frame with almost ritualistic care, using a magnifying glass to scan the ornate walnut moulding. He noticed a small indentation at the base, similar to the mark he had observed in Professor Bernet's study. "Monsieur Marcel," he said without taking his eyes off the frame, "when was the last time someone took this painting off the wall?" The butler cleared his throat. "As far as I know, monsieur, it hasn't moved in years. But young Rochefort asked for the keys to the gallery 2 weeks ago to inspect some paintings. He didn't mention this one in particular." Poirot turned slowly, his right eyebrow raised. "And you were granted unsupervised access?" "Only during the day, sir. Never at night. The keys are in my custody every evening." Poirot nodded his thanks, slightly, then asked for a small ladder to be brought to him. He cautiously climbed it until he was standing face to face with the canvas. Using a small metal hook, he discreetly examined the gap between the frame and the wall. Something creaked. Not the frame itself, but the wall behind it, as if there was a slight slack in the panelling. With slow movements he removed the painting, revealing a gap in the woodwork. Inside, hidden between two slats, was a yellowish paper envelope. Poirot delicately removed it and placed it on a nearby table. The envelope was sealed with red wax, with no return address, but with an engraved seal, a heraldic shield with a raven and 3 stars. Without breaking the seal yet, Poirot looked again at the empty frame. "My God, this wasn't just a makeshift hiding place," he murmured. "This painting was spinning because someone I needed to get to this, or prevent others from finding it." That afternoon, Poirot discreetly summoned Sylvain Rochefort to the library. There was something in the restaurateur's controlled impatience that intrigued him. "Monsieur Rochefort, do you know this symbol?" he asked, showing the unopened envelope. The young man looked at him closely. A shadow crossed his face. "Yes, it's the Leclerc family coat of arms. They were private art collectors in the 19th century. Professor Burnet was researching their legacy. And what connection does it have with the Dervaux? A few months ago, the professor confided in me that he suspected that one of the paintings here, perhaps the Night in Geneva, had originally belonged to the Leclercs and was stolen during the Napoleonic Wars. If confirmed, it would have legal implications. It could even invalidate Miss Dervaux's current inheritance. And you believe that theory was true? I don't know, but if it was, someone here had a lot to lose." Poirot slid the envelope towards the young man. "He hasn't opened it." "Do you want to know why? Out of respect for the dead? No, because sometimes what is hidden doesn't need to be read to tell the truth. The mere fact that this hiding place existed, Monsieur Rochefort, already upsets the balance of this house." That evening, Poirot dined with the others in the main drawing-room. The atmosphere was thick, filled with silences that crackled louder than the blazing fireplaces. Aunt Geneviève barely touched her soup. Aimée kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Lucille watched Sylvain with a mixture of fear and anxiety, and Colonel Lemaitre, almost ostentatiously, crossed and uncrossed his legs, as if his impatience had more to do with time than with food. "An old house like this," Poirot commented suddenly, "has layers, like a painting with layers of varnish, layered on top of each other. Sometimes you only have to peel one back to discover what wasn't meant to be seen." "Are you referring to a recent discovery?" Lemaitre asked dryly. "Perhaps, Monsieur le Colonel. I found something behind the Night in Geneva, and that something was destined not to be found. The tension was immediate." Aimée clenched her napkin. Lucille looked away. Marcel stopped dead in his tracks, a tray in his hand. "And are you going to tell us what it was, Monsieur Poirot?" Sylvain intervened, forcing a smile. Poirot looked at him for a long time. "Not yet. The truth needs time and suitable witnesses." He finished his glass of wine and stood up. "Good night, my friends. But be careful. Some frames don't fit by accident." Later, alone in his room, Poirot placed the still-sealed envelope next to a letter he had just written. Inside, it was a note, open only if the canvas rotates again. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, smoothed his moustache thoughtfully, and muttered, "Pictures don't spin by choice. They spin out of fear, or warning. And in the Dervaux house, both of these things seem to be hiding around every corner." Chapter 4. The Absent Person's Will. The next morning, Poirot requested a copy of the will of the late Henri Dervaux, the family patriarch and former owner of the art collection. Aimé reluctantly agreed, leading the detective to the study where the family's legal documents were kept in a wall-mounted safe. The code was entered with slightly trembling fingers. "My father left everything in the hands of the notary maître, Jouvet. But he kept a copy here, for safekeeping, he said. I never imagined I'd have to give it to you for this reason." Poirot took the sealed envelope, examined it, and after obtaining Aimé's permission, opened it with great care. His gaze scanned the pages quickly, but stopped at a paragraph on the second page. He pursed his lips and read aloud. "And in the event that any of the works of art listed here turn out to legally belong to another family or entity, said work must be returned, and the rest of the collection will remain in the hands of my daughter, Aimée Dervaux." He closed the document with almost ceremonious precision, and returned it to its envelope. "Curious, mademoiselle. This passage isn't worded like a standard clause. It seems a very specific provision. Do you know what your father meant?" "Not exactly. He used to say that some pieces had a history, and that history can sometimes reclaim what's its own. But he never suggested he'd stolen anything." "He didn't necessarily do it, mademoiselle," Poirot replied delicately. "Sometimes sin travels with the object, not the bearer." Later, Poirot requested an audience with the notary Jouvet at his office in the village. The lawyer, a neat, curt-mannered man, received him without enthusiasm, but with the courtesy that Poirot's reputation commanded. "Did you write Mr. Dervaux's will?" the detective asked. "That's right. At your request, we updated it 8 months ago. You insistently added that clause about the works. You said you'd received information from an academic, a certain Burnet, about possible disputes over origin. And did you consider that there were reasonable grounds to suspect the origin of any piece? I only document, sir. But I did notice that Mr. Dervaux seemed uneasy. He even asked me to discreetly contact an expert specializing in looted art." Poirot nodded. Each new piece confirmed what he already suspected. Professor Burnet wasn't researching out of mere academic passion. He was looking for something concrete, something that could alter not only the history of a painting, but the balance of an entire heritage. Back at the mansion, Poirot found Lucille Bernet waiting for him in the conservatory. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her expression showed a determination she hadn't shown before. "Monsieur Poirot, I remembered something else. Tell me, mademoiselle. The night before my uncle died, I heard him open a safe in his room. It was strange, because he hated using it. He always said, 'True courage isn't locked away, it's observed.'" "And did you hear anything else?" "Yes. A few minutes later, I heard him muttering, as if he were talking to someone. But when I got closer, I only saw his silhouette through the glass. He was alone, although I swore he responded to a voice. Poirot watched her for a moment in silence. "Do you believe in hallucinations, mademoiselle? Yours or mine?" "Those of a man burdened with secrets too big." That evening, Poirot walked down the gallery, once more, now alone with Marcel, the butler, whose composure had always been exemplary. "Tell me, Mr. Marcel, did you also work with Mr. Henri Dervaux?" "For 34 years, Monsieur Poirot. I watched Mademoiselle Aimée grow up, and I knew every acquisition of the gentleman, every argument, every gesture of regret that he never confessed out loud. And did you also know the origin of this painting?" Marcel stopped. He took a deep breath. "Not in detail, but I do know that it arrived in an unusual way. One winter night, without papers, without a receipt, without any history. It just appeared. Mr. Dervaux didn't want to talk about it. And you never doubted its legitimacy. Monsieur Poirot, in this house we learned long ago that the most valuable things usually come with silence." Poirot turned slowly towards the painting. And silence, like art, ages poorly when exposed to light. Upon returning to his room, Poirot opened the envelope sealed with the Leclerc crest. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper folded in 3. He unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a letter, nor a will. It was a certificate of ownership, issued in Geneva in 1805, of the original painting. "The Night in Geneva," signed by Etienne Leclerc. Below, a recent handwritten note, unsigned. The copy was hung up to protect the real one. The original never left this house. Poirot sat silently, holding the document between his gloved fingers. A murder, a fake painting, and a secret buried under generations of silence. The next step, I knew, wasn't to find the culprit. It was to get him to give himself away. Chapter 5. The Name Among the Pigments. At dawn on the 4th day, Poirot presented himself at the gallery with a small leather briefcase, accompanied by a restorer who had come from Paris at his request, Monsieur Delacroix, a discreet expert known for his ability to detect forgeries without leaving a trace of his analysis. "You will treat this work with the respect it deserves, but with the truth as your only priority," Poirot told the restorer with a slight nod. Delacroix nodded, carefully unfolding his instruments. Aimée, visibly nervous, watched from the threshold of the gallery, refusing to come any closer. Poirot had explained to her that the painting might not be the original, and that the key to the whole mystery might be hidden behind the canvas. Her reaction was icy silence, followed by an almost imperceptible nod. "The canvas doesn't look like it's from the early 19th century, Delacroix murmured, examining the back with an ultraviolet flashlight. "And look at this. There's a second layer of primer. More recent." Using fine tweezers, he delicately removed part of the canvas's edge. Beneath the top layer of paint, barely visible to the naked eye, a different stroke was revealed. Not the dreamlike colours of Gustave Moreau, but thicker, angular lines, and most revealingly, a signature. "Etienne Leclerc," said Poirot, as if confirming a feeling. There you have it. The painting hanging in the gallery was an exact copy, superimposed over the original. An artistic camouflage, obscuring not only its value, but its history. In the library, Poirot gathered everyone present. This time his tone was more severe, his gaze more incisive. "My friends, I'm afraid that the night in Geneva, it's not the work everyone thought they saw. It's a skillful replica, painted over the original. The silence was absolute." "But why would anyone do that?" Aimée asked, her voice breaking. "Because they knew that if the painting's authenticity was discovered, they could lose it. And perhaps something more important than art, their heritage." "Are you suggesting that my father," the young woman began, stopping at Poirot's grave face. "Not necessarily, but someone in this house knew, and I dare say, more than one." Coroner Lemaitre stood up abruptly. "This is absurd. A painted copy over an original. What the hell for?" "To protect it, monsieur, or to hide it," Poirot replied firmly. "And someone didn't want Professor Bernet to discover it. He came too close. Perhaps he even knew it." "And that's why they killed him?" Lucille asked quietly. Poirot walked slowly around the room, stopping in front of each face. "The professor discovered the double canvas. Maybe he entered the gallery that night, removed the painting, tested his theory, and placed the certificate in the gap. But someone saw him, someone who feared their world would crumble if the truth became known." "And the splinter in your eye?" Sylvain asked. "An accident? Hardly," Poirot replied. "A push, a struggle perhaps, in an attempt to retrieve the document or prevent me from removing it from the house. And in the struggle, a piece of the frame became a fatal weapon." That night, Poirot retired early, leaving everyone overwhelmed by his thoughts. But before going to sleep, he wrote a short note and slipped it under the door of Marcel's room. "The butler," he said, "tomorrow at dawn, I wish you to accompany me to the north wing, where the 17th century landscapes used to hang. There's something that still doesn't fit, and I think you can help me." Poirot knew the pieces were already on the board. Only one last maneuver was needed before the culprit would reveal his move. In the dead of night, with the house plunged into silence, Poirot opened the secret drawer of his trunk and took out a small magnifying glass, a white glove, and a letter he had not shown to anyone. It was signed by Professor Bernet, dated 5 days before his death, and addressed directly to him. "My dear Poirot, if you ever receive this, it is because I failed to prevent what I feared. What you will find behind the painting is real, and if someone dies from it, it will be because art was never just beauty, but truth with a price." Poirot slowly closed the letter. "The truth, Monsieur Bernet, always demands payment, and at dawn someone in the house would pay theirs." Chapter 6. Traces on the Varnish. Dawn brought with it a thick fog that clung to the windows like a persistent veil, making every corner of the mansion seem older and more laden with secrets. Poirot, punctual as a Swiss watch, waited in the north wing corridor. Marcel arrived silently, his jacket neatly ironed and his service gloves as white as the day before. "Thank you for coming, monsieur," said Poirot in a courteous but firm tone. "I wish you to tell me everything you know about the reorganization of the works in this wing, particularly the transfer of the Flemish landscape that was here until recently." The butler blinked in surprise. "How do you know?" "Because I counted the hooks on the walls," replied Poirot, "and because I found on the back of the frame, 'Sunset in Bruges, traces of black pigment identical to those on the frame. Of the night in Geneva, that picture used to hang here, didn't it?" Marcel sighed. His voice became deep. "Yes, a few years ago, Mr. Dervaux ordered it moved to the main gallery. He said it deserved more light, but actually, I think he moved it because someone had asked for it." "Who?" "Professor Burnet. He said that painting smacked of forgery." Poirot nodded slowly. "And that's when the whispers started. And the night visits," Marcel added, lowering his voice. "I saw him several times wandering around alone with his lantern, murmuring, as if talking to the paintings." "I wasn't talking to the paintings, Monsieur Marcel. I was talking to history, because, as you well know, varnish hides more than dust." Poirot bent down and used his walking stick to pick up a small, shiny splinter from the ground. He held it delicately between his fingers. "This, my dear friend, isn't wood. It's a fragment of acrylic varnish, a material that's far too modern for a work from 1805, which means someone tried to preserve the forgery to make it look older. Recently." Later that day, Poirot summoned Sylvain Rochefort to the music room, away from the rest of the guests. The young restaurateur arrived with a worried expression, staring at the windows as if afraid someone was listening outside. "Monsieur Rochefort, I need you to tell me the truth. The whole thing. It's no longer just a matter of art, but of life and death. What do you want to know? Were you involved in the restoration of the night in Geneva?" Sylvain hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes, not officially. It was one night 2 months ago. The professor asked me to help him remove the top varnish to check a stroke he'd noticed. I agreed. He was obsessed with discovering whether the painting was a forgery. And it was. No, what we found was worse. An authentic work covered by a copy, painted over. Burnet said the discovery was scandalous, that it should be made public. And then we argued. He wanted to take the original certificate to Geneva for validation. I warned him that would put Aimée in danger, that she would lose everything. He called me a coward. From then on, we didn't speak again. Poirot watched him silently, without moving. "And that night, Monsieur Rochefort, where were you when he died?" "In my room. Lucille can confirm that. We were together, arguing, but together." Poirot didn't reply. He just jotted something down in his notebook and stood up. "Thank you, sir. It was enlightening." As the afternoon turned orange, Poirot walked through the house with gentle steps, observing faces that were already familiar, but no less disconcerting. Aimée, increasingly absent, clutched a letter she showed to no one. Lucille avoided everyone's gaze, and Colonel Lemaitre watched everyone with the irritation of someone who knows he's no longer in control of the narrative. In the central corridor, Poirot stopped dead. A faint creak sounded behind him. He turned. No one. He bent down, touched the floor. A light trace of varnish on the baseboard. Very recent. Too much. "So someone tried to seal the secret last night," he murmured. "But paintings don't just preserve the paint. They also preserve the hands that touch them." That evening, Poirot sat alone in the library in front of the fireplace. With a slow movement, he took out the envelope containing the 1805 certificate and placed it on the coffee table within view. Then he turned off all the lights except for one low lamp. He sat down, crossed his legs and waited. 30 minutes passed. 40. 53 minutes later, a silhouette appeared in the doorway. He entered without turning on the light. He approached the envelope with one hand extended. "Don't touch it, madam," said Poirot, in a calm but authoritative voice. The figure froze. It was Aimée d'Herveau. "What are you doing here, mademoiselle?" She lowered her head, not responding. Was he going to destroy it? "No," he finally said. "I just wanted to read it again. See if I misunderstood." Poirot stood up slowly. "You didn't kill the professor, but you know who did, and you've been trying to protect him ever since." She pressed her lips together. A single tear ran down her cheek. "My father told me that art sometimes weighs more than a family name, that if the past ever came knocking at the door, I had to choose between truth and blood." "And she chose blood," Poirot murmured, "like everyone in this house, until someone died." Poirot approached the fire and threw into it a false sheet of paper, a copy of the certificate he himself had drawn up that afternoon. "Tomorrow, mademoiselle, I'll summon everyone, and there will be no more veneers to hide the truth." She turned slowly toward the door. "What if no one wants to see it any more?" Poirot, with a sharp look, replied, "Then we'll show her." Chapter 7. The Meeting of the Absent. The morning began with a tension that clung to the walls like damp. The d'Herveau mansion, always silent, seemed to hold its breath. Marcel summoned the inhabitants one by one. At 10 o'clock sharp, in the Hall of Mirrors, on Monsieur Poirot's orders. The arrangement was deliberate. A circular table in the centre, with no headboard. The fire was burning gently. A single document on the table, the real certificate of ownership, signed by Etienne Leclerc. No one asked why it was there. Everyone, deep down, knew. Poirot stood up. His presence filled the room like a steady glow. "My lords and ladies, thank you for coming. This house has witnessed secrets trailing between paintings and hallways for generations. But one in particular has exacted a bloody price. Today, that price must be revealed." He approached the certificate. "This document proves that the night in Geneva, it legally belongs to the Leclerc family. It was hidden behind the painting. Professor Burnet found it, and for that he died." No one said anything. Sylvain looked down. Lucille laced her fingers tightly together. Aimée breathed slowly, her eyes glassy. Colonel Lemaitre crossed his arms, defiantly. Poirot continued. "Someone killed him because this paper destroyed his future. But to find the culprit, it wasn't enough to know who had a motive. You had to look at who tried to manipulate the events behind the crime." He turned to Sylvain. "Monsieur Rochefort, you restored part of the frame a few days ago, didn't you?" The young man swallowed. "Yes, I wanted to reinforce it. It was damaged, au revoir. Did you want to eliminate evidence?" "No, I just wanted to protect the work. I didn't know there was a gap behind it." Poirot didn't reply. He just turned to Colonel Lemaitre. "And you, Monsieur le Colonel, were the one who alerted Professor Burnet to possible forgeries a year ago. You planted the doubt in his mind." Colonel opened his mouth, but didn't reply. Poirot continued. However, it was not you who committed the crime. The whole room held its breath. Poirot stopped in front of Lucille, his voice lowered. Mademoiselle Bernay, where were you really on the night of your uncle's death? Lucille opened her eyes in horror. In my room, with Sylvain. All night? A silence. No. I went out for a moment, to get some water. And did you hear your uncle arguing? Yes, with someone. I don't know who. Poirot walked slowly around the table. It wasn't an argument, it was a threat. And it wasn't verbal, it was a struggle. But only one person had access to the frame, the passageway, the painting's hiding place, and control of the keys, Marcel. The butler stood up with an almost dignified slowness. That's ridiculous, monsieur. I served this house for over 30 years. Precisely. No one knows the dark corners better. No one else could have intercepted Professor Bernay, silenced him with a sharp splinter, and returned the painting to its place before dawn. No one, except you. Marcel clenched his fists. His voice came out hoarse. I did it for her, he said, looking at Aimée. Her father asked me to. He begged me to protect her name, her inheritance. He swore to me that the painting had been acquired, legally. But when Bernay questioned him, when he threatened to destroy everything... He stopped, unable to continue. Aimée looked at him with a mixture of horror and pity. Poirot lowered his gaze. His voice softened. Blind duty can lead to crime, monsieur. You thought you were protecting the past, but you killed the only man who could forgive the mistake. Lucille sobbed. Sylvain pressed his lips together. Colonel Lemaitre sat down, defeated. That night, the Fontainebleau police took Marcel away, but he offered no resistance. Before leaving, he handed Aimée a folded letter. From your father, he said. I never wanted to read it. Poirot was left alone in the gallery. The painting still hung, firm, motionless. But something had changed. The weight it held was no longer that of a secret, but that of revealed truth. The Belgian detective crossed his arms and muttered, and so Art spoke again, this time without needing to turn around. Chapter 8. The Reflection in the Sealed Letter. Mr. Henri Dervaux's letter was not opened immediately. Aimée held it for hours, as if it were a hot, dangerous object. Poirot, ever patient, didn't pressure her. He knew that some truths, even those in print, require more courage to be read than to be hidden. Finally, as evening fell, she joined Poirot in the greenhouse. The letter was still sealed. The sealing wax still bore the family monogram, a double D enclosed in a circle of bay leaves. "Shall I open it for you, mademoiselle?" asked Poirot, his voice as soft as the leaves crunching under his shoes. She shook her head. "No, my father wrote it for me, and if anyone should be held accountable for what he says, it's me." She tore the seal with tense hands, slowly unfolding the paper. Poirot watched her silently, studying not the words, but her reaction to them. Aimée read for several minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. Only, at the end, did she let out a slight tremble. Then she handed the letter to Poirot with a firm gesture. "Read it. I think you should know." Poirot took the paper, held it close to his eyes, and began to read in a low voice. "My dear Aimée, by the time you read this, I may no longer be with you, and if it has reached your hands, it's because past mistakes have come knocking. The night in Geneva didn't belong to me. I bought it under unclear circumstances at an auction in Vienna, where its origin was deliberately concealed. I learned years later that it was a piece stolen from the Leclerc collection. I couldn't return it, not because I didn't want to, but because I discovered that beneath that painting lay another, an ancient portrait, even more valuable, but whose history was linked to infamy. I decided to cover it up, order a replica, seal the past with varnish and silence. I asked Marcel to protect that secret, thinking I was protecting you. But every day since then, I knew I'd betrayed not just art, but you. If the truth has come to light, my only plea is that you do not perpetuate my error. The name d'Herveau can withstand shame, but you, my child, must not be burdened with a lie you did not construct. With everlasting love, your father, Henry." Poirot was silent for a long time. Then he placed the letter on the wicker table and leaned back slightly in his chair. "It's a confession, yes, but also a redemption. Your father knew what he had to do. He just didn't know when." "So, what do I do with this now?" Aimée asked, her voice drifting. What a restorer would do with a damaged work. Not erase it, but preserve it, with its cracks. The next day Poirot visited the office of the notary Jouvet. He had with him a copy of the Leclerc certificate and Henri d'Herveau's letter. "Monsieur, I beg you to register both documents," said Poirot, "and arrange for the official return of the painting to the Leclerc estate, or to his legal heirs, if they still exist." The notary looked at him as if he didn't understand the logic behind voluntarily giving up an artistic fortune. "And Miss d'Herveau agrees. She's no longer just the heir. She's now the restorer of a story that no one else wanted to tell in full." Later, that afternoon in the gallery, Poirot found Lucille Bernet gazing at the empty space where the painting had once hung. Her face had a calmer sadness, like a wound that had finally healed. "So it's over, Monsieur Poirot. Only the part that needed to be resolved fairly. The rest takes longer. Did my uncle know that his search would end in death?" Poirot looked at her with distant tenderness. "No, but I knew the truth never comes out unscathed." Lucille turned to him. "And you? Do you think art is worth it?" Poirot smiled slightly. "I think art reflects the best and worst of the human soul. Sometimes, when it breaks, it also shows us what we are." She nodded. Then she walked away without looking back. Poirot prepared to leave. In his carefully folded suitcase, he packed a copy of Henri d'Herveau's letter and another of the Leclerc certificate, not as trophies, but as reminders that even the most immobile beauty can contain carefully painted crimes. As the car drove along the gravel path, Poirot took one last look at the gallery. The painting was no longer there, but his shadow, like the echo of a revealed secret, lingered between the walls. Chapter 9. The Last Invisible Stroke. 3 days after his departure from the d'Herveau mansion, Poirot was in his Paris hotel, meticulously reviewing his morning correspondence. Among the thank you letters, invoices, and notifications from the Belgian consulate, one in particular caught his eye. Thick paper, no return address, sealed with gold wax. Upon breaking the seal, he found a brief note. The original hasn't left the house yet. Marcel didn't lie entirely. Some paintings contain more than one crime. Go back if you want to understand the last one. It was not signed. Poirot read the note 3 times, in complete silence. Then he stood up, adjusted his jacket and called, "Room service." "Do me a favour, young man. I need a car back to Fontainebleau." "Right away." Upon his arrival, Aimé greeted him with bewilderment. Something happened? The will? The Leclercs? Poirot shook his head. "No, but I fear history still holds one last hidden trace, one that wasn't painted with a brush, but with intention." Back in the now empty gallery, Poirot moved with slow but precise steps. Each missing frame left a ghostly silhouette on the wall. He stopped in front of the space where a secondary piece hung under the willow, 1852, a bucolic landscape attributed to a certain Jules Ferrand, a painting that no one had mentioned during the interrogations. "Who moved this painting?" he asked aloud. Aimé broke away. "That one?" It was one of the ones Sylvain packed for legal review. "Why?" Poirot bent down, examining the baseboard. There was a tiny indentation, as if something had been forced beneath the wall. He took a paper knife from his pocket, inserted the point delicately, and the wood opened like a hidden compartment. Inside, carefully rolled up, was a scroll wrapped in silk and protected with a blue velvet ribbon. Poirot unrolled it with extreme caution. It was a second certificate of ownership, but this time not for the painting, the night in Geneva, but from another. One never listed in the Dervaux collection catalogue, portrait of a young woman with a medallion, attributed to a Flemish artist who died in 1790. "Aimé," said Poirot in an icy tone, "do you recognize this title?" She frowned. "No, I've never heard of it. I don't remember ever seeing a painting with that name in this house." Poirot nodded without surprise. "Because it wasn't exposed. It was hidden. And it was hidden since before you were born." Hours later, Poirot reviewed the private records of the deceased Henri Dervaux with the help of a local archivist. Among the letters and purchase contracts, he found an undated letter signed by a certain F.J. "I appreciate you keeping the young woman's portrait a secret. The medallion she wears around her neck represents more than you imagine. Keep it out of sight. History isn't ready for her yet." Poirot slowly closed his eyes. When he opened them, his expression was pure concentration. "It's not an ordinary portrait, it's symbolic, a work of a private nature, perhaps even subversive. And whoever hid it did so not out of courage, but out of fear." The next day Sylvain returned to the estate to oversee the transfer of the remaining paintings from storage. Poirot intercepted him in the garden, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves like golden brushstrokes. "Monsieur Rochefort," Poirot began bluntly, "you knew about this second hiding place, did you not?" Sylvain tried to hide it, but his face betrayed him. "I suspected." Professor Bernet spoke of invisible layers. He hinted to me that if the first painting concealed a crime, the second concealed a deeper betrayal. And what kind of betrayal? a personal one. Bernet said the portrait was of a young noblewoman repudiated by her family, for reasons considered immoral at the time. He believed the artist had encoded a hidden message in the medallion she wore. Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And do you think the professor intended to bring that to light?" "No doubt. But I was also afraid of what it would reveal. I said that some names don't outlive certain portraits." Poirot looked at him in silence. "And so, someone decided that a crime was a reasonable price to pay for forgetting." That evening, Poirot sat once more in the gallery. There were no paintings on the walls, no fresh fingerprints on the varnish, only the echo of what had been discovered and what had yet to be revealed. He took a black-covered notebook out of his pocket. He wrote precisely, "Second hidden crime, second silenced truth. But there will be no third canvas. Art has spoken twice. Let conscience speak now." And he closed the notebook with the same firmness with which he closed his cases, with logic and with compassion, because even an invisible trace, when revealed, can forever change the face of the past. Chapter 10. The echo of the silent brush, the morning, was clear and serene in Fontainebleau, but the atmosphere inside the Dervaux mansion felt stifled, as if the walls themselves refused to let out even the last whisper. Aimée sat in her father's office, leafing through the collection's old catalogues. Since the revelation of the second certificate and the mysterious portrait of a young woman with a medallion, the calm had been replaced by a feeling of dull discomfort, as if the past had not yet said its last word. Poirot appeared at the door, with a courteous gesture. "Mademoiselle, do you have a moment?" She nodded. There was a different expression on her face, less confusion, more determination. "Have you found out, monsieur? Where is that portrait?" "I think so. But it's not in the collection or in the official records. It's out of reach of all eyes, as his father said in a marginal note I found in his personal notebook." Aimée frowned. "And what does that mean?" Poirot approached the large built-in cupboard at the back of the office. He gently tapped on the back of the wood. It sounded hollow. He stepped back, took a thin tool from his pocket, and precisely pried open an almost imperceptible section of the panel. A click responded. The wood gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a thick linen cloth, lay the painting. Aimée approached, holding her breath. Poirot unwrapped the portrait with extreme delicacy. The image that emerged was disturbing. A young woman with a pale face, dark eyes filled with suppressed sadness, and a medallion on her chest that seemed to glow with its own light despite her age. The style was unmistakably Flemish, but the gesture of the portrait, almost modern in its emotional charge. Poirot examined the medallion with his magnifying glass. "Look here," he murmured. "It's not just an ornament. It's a miniature within the painting. And if you look closely, it seems to represent two hands clasped together." "A wedding ring?" Aimée asked. "No, mademoiselle, a gesture of farewell, a forced farewell." He turned to her. "Your father didn't hide this painting for fear of its artistic value. He did it because of its history. This young woman," he pointed to the portrait, "was, according to the painter's archives, Marguerite Dervaux, an ancestor of his." Aimée paled. What happened to him?" Poirot held his gaze. She was repudiated for falling in love with a woman, and that portrait was secretly commissioned by the artist himself, who shared her exile and her pain. It became a symbol of a history the family preferred to erase. Aimée took a step back, impressed. So, my father knew, and he preferred, to hide it, perhaps out of fear of scandal, perhaps out of loyalty to his lineage. But in the end, he protected it. He guarded it so well that not even Marcel knew of its existence. There was a long silence. Aimée sat in front of the portrait and stroked her ancestor's face with her fingertips. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "and so, alone." Poirot inclined his head slightly, because she was silenced, as was the painting, as was the love it represents. But now that he's found her, will he leave her alone again? That night the mansion's gallery was reopened, but this time not to display wealth or lineage, but for a quiet exhibition. In the centre of the room, under a warm, soft light, stood the portrait of the young woman with a medallion. The other paintings still remained in boxes, as if waiting their turn to tell their own truths. Aimée invited only a few people. Poirot, Lucille, Sylvain, and the notary Jouvet. No one spoke for the first few minutes. They just watched. Poirot, arms crossed, watched in silence. "Art can hide lies," he said finally, "but it can also be the only thing that preserves the truth when everyone else has fallen silent." Lucille, standing next to Sylvain, whispered, "Do you think this redeems the Dervaux family?" "No," Poirot replied. "Nothing redeems a prolonged denial. But acknowledging it is a first step toward justice." Aimée nodded slowly. Her voice was low but clear. "This painting will never be hidden again. And if anyone wants to know who Marguerite Dervaux was, they'll know." Poirot bowed slightly, satisfied. "Then, mademoiselle, the work is complete." That night, as silence once again enveloped the mansion, Poirot packed his suitcase. He packed his father's letter, his notebook, and a photographic copy of the portrait. Not out of vanity, but because, as he himself thought, some cases don't end with jail, they end with memory. And as he closed the door behind him, he knew that in that house, finally, the brush had stopped trembling. Chapter 11. The Signature in the Light of Dawn. Poirot remained in Fontainebleau for another day, not out of necessity, but out of intuition. Something still hung formless in the air, like an unfinished brushstroke in a corner of the canvas. And although the crime was solved, the painting uncovered, and the truth unearthed, a subtle question lingered. Who had sent the anonymous letter? The note that had brought him back, that had guided him to the hidden compartment, was not written by Marcel, nor by Sylvain, nor by Aimée. It was a voice from outside the apparent climax, a shadow among shadows. Poirot could not leave without knowing its origin. Shortly before dawn, as the first ray of sunlight crossed the iron gate of the eastern garden, Poirot found himself in the small private office that had belonged to Professor Julien Bernet. It had not been touched since his death. Books, letters, manuscripts in the margins, everything was just as he had left it. Poirot examined the desk with his fingers covered in fine linen gloves. touching the objects as if listening to the notes of a forgotten instrument. The professor wasn't just investigating art, he murmured. He was investigating the soul hidden within it. In the second drawer, between the folds of an auction guide, Poirot found a field notebook bound with green thread. Inside, cryptic notes, dates, names of dealers, works sold. And at the end, a page written in fresh ink, in angular, hurried handwriting. If anything happens to me, may this truth never die. Poirot will understand. The painting is double, but the story triple. You won't find it on the frame. It's in the signature, not the graffiti. The other one. Poirot frowned. The other firm? He returned to the gallery and requested that the painting be brought back. Portrait of the young woman with a medallion. They placed it on a table with its back exposed. Poirot asked for privacy. For almost an hour, he inspected every corner of the frame, every nail, every fibre of the linen. Finally, in a seam along the edge, sewn between the fabric and the frame, he noticed a small protuberance. He cut it with precision. Inside, hidden, like a seed, was a second document, a letter dated 1874, signed by Marguerite Dervaux. It was brief, a testimony, a defence, a confession. If anyone finds this, please know that I am not ashamed. I loved and was loved. I was torn from my home, erased from the portrait of my lineage, but they could not erase my truth. This painting is my voice. To whoever listens, thank you. Poirot closed his eyes. In his mind's eye, he saw Marguerite not as an oil painting, but as a living young woman whose story had been silenced for generations. And yet there she was, not just painted, but written, signed, witnessed. In the library, Poirot gathered Aimée, Lucille, and Sylvain. He spread the letter on the table. I found the true signature, not the artist's, but the woman portrayed. He calmly told them about the discovery. No one spoke at first, but it was Aimée who finally broke the silence. So, she left a legacy. Not one of lineage, Poirot corrected gently. One of courage. Lucille touched the edge of the paper with an involuntary bow. And the anonymous letter? Who sent it? Poirot turned to Sylvain. The young man avoided his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. It was me. The professor made me promise that if anything happened to him, I was to warn you, that only you would know how to follow the right path. I didn't want to get further involved. I was afraid of what I might discover. And yet you did it, Poirot replied. And that, monsieur, does you more credit than doing it in broad daylight. That afternoon, Notary Jouvet received a new instruction. A copy of Marguerite's letter would be registered along with the original certificate. Not as legal evidence, but as an act of reparation. Before leaving for the last time, Poirot walked through the gallery one last time. The painting was now hanging in its new location, scented clean, protected by a plaque that read Marguerite Dervaux, 1817-1875. Portrait with medallion painted in exile, discovered in silence. Preserved in memory, the Belgian detective smiled slightly. Then, with his suitcase in one hand and his cane in the other, he headed toward the exit. As he crossed the door, he murmured, "The signature wasn't in the corner of the canvas, but in the value of not having been erased. and with that he left behind the house where the paintings spoke, and finally someone had heard them. Chapter 12. Outcome and Justice. Paris, a few weeks later. In his tidy apartment on the Rue des Deux, Petit Champ, Hercule Poirot sat by the window, enjoying a perfectly balanced cup of mint tea. In front of him, on the polished oak table, rested a copy of Le Figaro, with a modest headline in the cultural section, "A Redeemed Inheritance, the Truth Behind the Portrait of Marguerite Dervaux." Poirot lowered the newspaper slowly, his fingers gently tapping the rim of his cup. The case was closed. Not judicially. Marcel had died of natural causes in his cell before facing trial, but morally. The truth had come out, and what needed to be corrected had been corrected. But what held him back that morning wasn't pride in having solved the enigma, nor the satisfaction of having restored a erased name. It was the echo of a phrase spoken by the young Aimée Dervaux as she said goodbye to him. "Sometimes, Monsieur Poirot, it's not a question of discovering the culprit, but of repairing what everyone allowed." Poirot had thought about it for a long time. It wasn't the typical conclusion, not one with handcuffs or flight or theatrical confessions, but with acknowledged silences, with absences restored, with truths rescued from the dust. Days earlier, during a small ceremony in the restored gallery of the Dervaux mansion, Aimée had read Marguerite's letter aloud in front of a select group of historians, family members, and members of the Fontainebleau City Council. "I was erased from history, but art preserved me. And today I return to this house not as a scandal, but as a memory." Poirot had observed her in silence. Aimée didn't tremble when she spoke. Her voice, once fragile, now resonated clearly. Her posture conveyed something she'd never fully felt before: belonging. Not to a material inheritance, but to a moral responsibility. Lucille Burnet, standing beside him, held the portrait frame as a new plaque was placed. Donated to the Museum of Art and Identity in Paris by Aimée Dervaux. Sylvain Rochefort never returned to work at the mansion. He had accepted a restoration scholarship in Rome. Distance, as he had confessed to Poirot, was a way of understanding what art sometimes forces us to keep silent. Lucille decided to accompany him, closing the cycle of shadows her uncle had left behind. Now back in his apartment, Poirot reviewed his research notebook for the last time. The crime, committed by Marcel, driven by blind loyalty. The cause, a secret, hidden in art, feared by society, silenced for generations. The revelation, a portrait hidden within another, a signature sewn to the edge of the canvas, and a love sealed in the gesture of a medallion. The resolution, justice not by punishment, but by exposure. Poirot wrote in his notebook, in blue ink, the crime was solved with logic, the truth with compassion and art, with memory. Then he closed his notebook, stood up with precision, and walked to his dressing table. He adjusted. His tie aligned the ends of his moustache with a pocket comb, and looked at himself in the mirror. So, the case of the night in Geneva, the painting that turned only at dawn, has come to an end. And with a slight smile, Poirot turned on his heels and walked away with a short, elegant stride, as if he had already sensed that somewhere in the world another shadow was preparing to rise, and another mystery to be revealed.